Thanks, Tom, for the introduction. So I often find myself quoting, the madmen of advertising, whether it's David Ogilvy, Leo Burnett, Bill Bernbach is a big favourite of mine. But Mark Ritson did a piece recently, which was all about finding quotes from today's marketers. And I thought it was a brilliant idea. But today we're going to do the opposite of that, as Don was saying. We're going back 400 years to the period of the Renaissance, and hopefully it will be a bit of fun. So Shakespeare was a genius. There's a word called bardoltery. I don't know if you've heard of it before or not, but I think I'm a bit guilty of it, which is where you become a bit obsessed by him. Now, I'm beaming in today from Warwickshire, from Shakespeare land. My son has had to have a COVID test, but I'm not obsessed with him because I live here. I didn't grow up here. I'm a Lancashire lass by origin. I didn't study him a lot at school. I did see The Tempest at the Edinburgh Festival, which was amazing. But it's really just how amazing he was. He, as it says here, he had three great assets that I think communicators can learn from. And that's any piece of communication, but we can definitely apply them to advertising. So he was a great philosopher. His critics say that Shakespeare taught us to understand human nature. His skills, he represented human character in an amazing way, and people who were nothing like him. And that's what advertisers have to do as well, think about their target audience and how to bring them to life, how to make those connections with them. He leveraged power of diversity and the kind of people that he represented. And I also read an academic article which suggested actually that Shakespeare may be the originator of System 1 and System 2 thinking. So why might they say that? Well, that's because he recognised that people feel first and then they think. He was a playwright, and the word itself gives us an indication of how people like Shakespeare were viewed in that time. So playwright is akin to wheelwright. They had to be incredibly prolific and create a lot of content. And what Shakespeare did was he used his understanding of his audience to create content that they would enjoy, that they would find highly relevant. So to give you an example, Macbeth he created for James I, who was obsessed with magic and witches. He'd written a book about them. He was from Scotland. And so combining those things, he knew he could create something that his audience would love. But of course, you can have a great idea and write a great play, but you're reliant on your actors to bring it to life. And yes, Shakespeare did appear on the stage himself. He was inspired, we understand, by his childhood in Stratford, where he saw plays from a young age with his father. But he also relied on other people. So Richard Burbage, who was the exception. So he was famous. He earned a lot of money. He was the Hollywood star of the era, really. And he was also inspired by Will Kemp, the comedian. But a lot of actors in those days didn't earn a lot of money. And actually, they had to be very careful. They were seen as vagabonds, and there were laws that were written against them. If they were found wandering the streets of London, they would end up in prison, no questions asked. So quite a tough time to exist. And if you look at the phrases that appear on here, you can see that he also got embedded in our culture today. So we use a lot of his quotes in our everyday language. So you might be thinking, yeah, well, this is all very well and very interesting, Lynne, this story you're telling us. But what's it got to do with advertising? So I thought what we could do is take an example of one of the award-winning ads from the works. The first one, in fact, Walker's Crisps ad. So the philosophy part of that was, they understood, and what happens in this ad, for those of you that haven't seen it, is you see various people eating crisps in sandwiches, and the people who are looking on at them look quite disgusted and shocked at this habit that these people have got. And so it asks the question, are you a crisps in or a crisps out person? So the philosophy part of this is, understanding that crisps in sandwiches is a thing, and people who eat them love them. The playwright, how do you turn that insight into something interesting? Well, it's actually that tension, that some people love them, some people hate them. And that's the drama that's brought to life in the ad and the way it's told. And then the actor part, yes, great insight, great story. So this is a vignette ad, and it's set up brilliantly from the beginning, where we see an opening scene where this young boy looks in at what we assume is his grandma and says, "What are you doing?" Vignette ads can be quite confusing, but this one works really well for our lazy brains because it sets up the idea from the beginning. And we have also alongside it the Patsy Cline track, Crazy, because the crisps outers think that those who are eating it are a bit crazy. So there's no recipe for a great ad, but what I wanted to do, as Don was outlining, was just to share with you some of the levers that we see for creativity. And to keep the Shakespeare theme going, what I'm going to do is talk about each one with a quote. The first one's too obvious, so I won't get you to guess it, but the other ones, have a think about what you think they might be. So the first quote is about music. Oh, sorry, I got a bit lost. Let me retrack. So why also are we here? We're here because there's a challenge with how people are responding to advertising in Britain. So what we've seen is the trust in advertising has declined. You can see here that the enjoyment of advertising has declined, and that's creating a challenge for the industry. So I know Sophie Devonshire in the Brand Z talk this morning was talking about the industry coming together to inspire people to do better. I think that's what we're doing here today by talking about the levers that I was saying. I'm just going to take you through. You can move on to the next slide, please. And you know, we also know that creativity is really important. So brands that have great advertising are more meaningful and different. So it pays dividend not only in the short term, but also in the long term to invest in creative and effective advertising. Okay, if you can move on, please. And we know that the quality of your advertising also makes a difference. This is the data that Don was sharing with you earlier, where we see that in terms of delivering that return, creativity makes a difference. And I think what's really important about this is something you can do something about. You have the power to make a difference here. Okay, so let's take a look at some of those quotes then. So starting here, in sweet music is such art, killing care and grief of heart, fall asleep or hearing die. And we have another one on the next slide. I love these so much I had to put two in. Music can minister to minds diseased, pluck from the memory-rooted sorrow, raise out the written troubles of the brain, and with sweet oblivious antidote, cleanse the full bosom of all perilous stuff that weighs upon the heart. But you can see why I'm not an actor, but hopefully you get the idea from just reading that for yourselves, you know, just the power that music can have. And what we can do is just briefly show you on the next slide what that means. So music's used a lot in advertising. It's not that it's being used less these days, but the challenge we wanted you to think about is, are you using it optimally? So, you know, it can be used as a cue for the brand. The kind of music you use can create an atmosphere. It can help you tell the story. The choice of music can resonate with your audience or not. Yeah, it makes a massive difference to creating a personal connection with people. You can create a particular mood or an emotion. So if you think about a piece of cinema, you know, if you go to the movie and you watch a film, the music really guides that emotional journey that you go on. And the same is true with advertising. And the data you can see here is just contrasting the difference between the same visuals for an ad with a completely different music track. And you can see that people interpreted that very differently. So in one ad, they thought the couple were fighting, and in the other one, they thought they were being playful with each other, which led to a much more positive response. Okay, so let's look at the next area. So this one's easy. I warn you now, they get harder. So what's happening with the use of humour in advertising, as you'll see on this slide, is that humour is being used much less in advertising these days. And that's a great shame, because humour in advertising can help you earn attention, it creates memories, it helps you create content that can get shared. So, you know, an example here that we might think of would be the Tesco's Christmas ad, which, you know, some might have seen as quite a risky thing to do after COVID, but they took a really humorous, light-hearted look at some of the things that during COVID, all those little guilts that we had, they took a light-hearted view on that, and that worked very effectively for them. So it can help you earn attention. It creates a really good feel-good factor as well. But why is it being used less? I think that's something for our panel to discuss. Let's have a look at the next one, please. What about this one, folks? Can you guess what we're talking about here? When sorrows come, they come not single spies, but in battalions. Life feels like that sometimes, doesn't it? And it did in COVID with the kind of advertising that appeared then. So let's have a look at some figures behind that on the next slide, please. What you can see here, we saw that wave of ads where brands were all saying, we are here. We are here for you. And I think what they did was, you know, made us feel a bit more depressed rather than lifting our spirits as they were intended. That was because we just had this wallpaper of sameness. And you can see here the branding of those ads was really low. So in the bottom quarter of our database on average. I think purpose advertising can also be guilty of this. You know, it's ironic, isn't it? Brands here are looking to give people hope and to make a positive difference, yet we leave people feeling sad and depressed. You know, should brands be thinking of a different approach? What's next? Let's have a look at the next quote. This one's hard. In nature, there's no blemish but the mind. None can be called deformed but the unkind. Virtue is beauty. It goes on. Any guesses what that one might be? Let's have a look, please. So this is all about positive people portrayal. And so what you can see on the next slide here with the data that we're looking at is, you know, we see from our database, yes, it's important to have a diverse representation in your advertising. We're looking here, power is our measure of long-term equity. STSL is the short-term sales potential of the ads. Where we see a difference isn't just by including people, but by portraying them in a positive way. So it's not just about representation, it's about positive people portrayal and understanding them really well. Okay, let's move on to the next one. This one might be the toughest one yet. Unaccommodated man is no more but such a poor, bare, forked animal as thou art. So Shakespeare was great at insults. Let's have a look at those, please. Let's have a look at the next slide. So a tenuous connection. Hope you'll forgive me, but here we're looking at the use of anthropomorphism, animation, brand mascots. And what you can see here from this data is it makes a massive difference in terms of branding. It helps you to become associated with a particular visual. And it's also, what might surprise you more, is it's a great way to create distinctive advertising as well. Okay, let's move on to look at the next quote. Let's see if you can guess this one. To thine own self be true. I'm sure you can get this one, can you? Let's have a look at some data. So this is about the use of slogans. So that being a real distillation, often of either what the creative idea is about or what their brand is about. And we're seeing those are being used less and less over time. I'm not sure why that is, because as you'll see on the next slide with the data we're showing, actually slogans can be really beneficial. And I think you'll be surprised to know that they help your advertising in a static environment be more eye-catching. And they can help you be more distinctive as well. And you might make more sense that they can improve your branding, but also makes an even greater difference to branding when they're sung. And we see that less often. Although I'm sure if I said to you, did somebody say? You can fill in the blank. They're also great within businesses because they help the business understand what the brand is all about, which creates that shared common view of the brand, and that's what you're really looking to bring to life in your advertising. So, have a think about those three elements: philosopher, playwright, and actor. Are you doing those justice in your advertising? And I also wanted to flag, we talked about the Christmas Tesco ad. Why is it that we only put our best foot forward at Christmas? Effective advertising should be there all year round. So could we take some of these levers, not use all of them in an ad? I'm sure Simon might say that would just be a whole one big mess, but to use elements of them where appropriate and use them really well. Over to you.
Thank you, Lynn. So look, some interesting sort of data bombs there. And I just want to sort of kick off by sort of interrogating some of it. So I talked about IPA, sort of Peter Field's IPA analysis, and how, from that it would appear that the ROI of campaigns has been declining. Lynne's just shown data showing how, our data shows that measures like advertising annoys me have been increasing quite substantially, and we've got another bit of data there about how humour is essentially halved over the past 15 years or so. So, and this is, I'll ask you, Si, first. I'm kind of interested. What's going on?
I think it's a number of different things, really. I think advertising is generally quite easy to ignore. I think we ignore upwards of thousands of messages every day, and something I think that John Lewis in particular has always been incredibly good at is not telling you something but making you feel something. And you can't ignore a piece of work if it makes you feel something. I think a lot of the time when you're writing advertising, a lot of people fall into the trap of writing advertising to go into advertising. The reality is that most people don't want to see it. And I think the Shakespeare thing is really interesting because he was ultimately a storyteller. And storytellers are full of jeopardy and tension, and there's a villain and there's a hero. And I think that's what makes storytelling great. And I think if there's one thing that great advertising can get back to, it is to tell more stories, because more stories are just more interesting. They're distinctive. They make you generally feel something. And I think John Lewis has had a track record of doing that for over a decade. I think there are other brands that are doing it and should be doing it in different ways. I think a feeling doesn't always have to be emotion, doesn't always have to make you cry. Should be able to make you smile, should make you feel a bit of tension, a bit of jeopardy. I think if we can get back to some of the proper storytelling again, then I think that would be a very good thing for the industry to do as a whole.
Nick, maybe from your point of view, sort of from a more, you're a strategist by trade, and sort of feed into the creative development process in a very specific way, and measure its effect as well. Is something getting in the way about storytelling, potentially?
I don't know if anything's getting in the way of the storytelling, because I suspect the craft of telling stories is something we still have. I think one of the really interesting things, though, is that we're supposed to live in an age where we have more data on the consumer than ever, and yet you can't help but feel as if we've become disconnected from the people we're talking to.
Yeah.
And I think if you, to use Shakespeare as a great example of this, he got pretty direct feedback every night on the stuff he was doing, because people either would laugh or they wouldn't, or they would cry or they wouldn't, or they would look confused or they wouldn't, because they were standing there in the globe watching this stuff. And if you think about a lot of the creative renaissances that have happened before, whether it's the kind of the renaissance in the UK that planning had some role in, or whether it's the one in the US, often if you look into the things that people were saying about these renaissances, it's about writing advertising, and it would have been, a lot of it would have been film advertising or print advertising, in a way which kind of flatters and takes into account the people that are consuming this stuff. And remembering that you're talking to real people who generally don't really care about advertising, don't really care about brands, and have plenty of other better things to be doing than consuming your stuff. And that's often what drives you to do better, more entertaining, more engaging things. And I think, although perhaps there's a lot of data around now, very useful data about the things that people are doing, the places they're hanging out online, I can't help but feel as if we've kind of lost that connection with the way that people really feel about the stuff that we're putting in front of them.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'll come on to that actually in a second. Kirsten, from you're sitting in the client's hot seat over there. Sort of historically we worked together when we were on Volkswagen. You're now heading up marketing at ŠKODA, so a different sort of set of circumstances and budgets. But from your perspective, I mean, what's your take on some of those? The declines in potential declines in ROI of creativity, and what Si and Nick have been talking about in terms of the power of storytelling, and whether that's is from your perspective, Is that the issue, or are there other things going on?
I definitely see a lot of pressure coming in on marketing directors from many different directions. And, you know, I think there's definitely a lot of cost pressure on the marketing function these days. So you have to be, you really have to get your stakeholders on board to make any investment. And I think that can be really difficult. So it's much easier to focus on the short-term metrics because you can demonstrate the short-term commercial results. Whereas with some of these more powerful, engaging storytelling ads, it might take much longer to see the full benefit of what you're delivering because there'll be slower metrics to move. So you have to kind of really get everybody on board and make them feel that same ambition that you do to really commit to great creative.
Yeah, I mean that's really interesting, isn't it? And in terms of that shared ambition piece and the timeframes that are playing out. So, from your point of view, do you think that, you know, is digital part of the problem? You know, has that created a culture, marketing culture of short-termism, which has made it harder to justify those in sort of longer-term investments, for example?
Easier for people to see the returns on some of the digital activity, particularly the really tactically focused activity that might help you drive orders in the short term. I actually think, in a way, it's the opposite, that digital gives us a much better opportunity to really leverage these big creative ideas. And great creativity doesn't only work on the TV screen or in the cinema, but we see that it drives all the engagement with all of the other touch points as well. So actually, digital is a great opportunity, isn't it? But yeah, I suppose you have to commit to the big idea as well.
Something I mean, you mentioned the word ambition a second ago, and in our Brand Z session this morning, we had someone from essentially from Unilever talking about Marmite and using that as an example of actually overcoming the fear of taking risks. And you know, that using Marmite as one example, a successful example, according to our Brand Z, where risks had been taken and done so in a sort of very systematic, serial basis, and in order to create cultural impact. So, Si, let's start with you. What's your sense of, you know, has the relationship between agencies and clients been changing? And there's always been that fear factor in any advertising in developing it, but we're calling this session about, you know, creative renaissance because we're worried that the pounds that are being spent aren't as good, you know, effective as they used to be, and we're worried that, you know, and I'm wondering whether is there more of a climate of fear that's sort of undermining that sort of risk taking?
Yeah, without a doubt. But I think that's when it's almost going back to basics then becomes as a result of that, because we were talking about ambition, but I think the other word that we need there is confidence, right? Because when there is a little bit of fear and when you know you want to do something ambitious, you need to be confident in your product, you need to be confident in your agency, and I think more importantly, you need to be confident in the creative that is telling you that that story is right. I was lucky enough to be with one of the senior people at Unilever when Marmite was being discussed, and it was no, it wasn't. It was the hypnotizing idea, and the reason he loved it is because he just said hypnotizing haters, and it was simple, and it was basically that idea was sold on 2 words, and because it was so simple, it's very easy for him to sell it on to his boss and his peers, and that ambition becomes so much easier because you can always keep coming back to the absolute core of the idea, which is effectively conveyed in 2 words. So I think. Alongside ambition, you need confidence, but I think you also have to have simplicity. And one of the things that I was just reflecting on when we were talking about the audience and Shakespeare having a live audience, I always try and get my creatives to read the script to us, because to see the reaction of the story live on faces, and I'm going through a process now of reviewing an edit, and I'm watching the client's faces as they're watching it. You know if they're enjoying it or not, but that sense of an audience, I think, is incredibly important as well, and it makes it live and makes it very real.
Yeah. I mean, Kirsten, from your perspective, how do you what's your take on that risk factor, and how do you get your clients in an organisation to take that leap and go on that journey with you?
Yeah, definitely. It's hugely important to make sure that all of your most important stakeholders are going on the journey alongside you. So from my perspective, it's about making sure you've got that long-term vision and everyone's bought in. So for example, before you're talking about a big project, a big campaign, people are already in that space with you. They're excited and they want to do something big, and you have to set that ambition and set the ambition between the agency and the client team, so you're both really clear on what you're setting out to achieve, and then you hold yourself to account to firstly finding the idea and then secondly following through on it.
Sort of, how important is that sense of partnership with an agency?
I think it's hugely important, and I think it must be really difficult for clients where they've only been with their agency for a short period of time. We're really lucky. We've worked with Fallon, which is now part of Leo Burnett, on the ŠKODA account for over 40 years. So you build up this relationship of trust. And I think, every time that you create something that is effective and works well, you almost get some credit in the bank, which helps you to sell in your next idea or whatever it might be. So I think, building that partnership is really important. But I also think it's really important that you're honest with each other, and that everybody feels comfortable with acknowledging when certain elements might not have been as effective as you wanted them to be. Because if you don't have that kind of open discussion and learning, then you'll never move forward.
Yeah. I mean, Simon and Nikki, in different ways, I think you both touched on the power of that feedback, whether it's looking at as an edit, reactions on an edit suite, or whether it's just going out and speaking to audiences. I'm sort of interested in, how do you go about making great work as opposed to just meh sort of work? What are the things? I mean, it's not about a systematic method necessarily, but what are the principles about that tends to, help along the way?
I've got quite a basic one, which is, are we excited about presenting this?
Right.
It's really, talk about system one, it is system one, right?
Yeah.
Are you excited? Are you skipping to the meeting going, I cannot, and Ben Priest, we were talking about him earlier, but he would have this showmanship, and he would love to go into a room and be proud of what he's about to present. And, we're pitching at the moment and we're sitting there going, are we excited about what we're about to present? And I think it feels quite basic and quite a normal thing to say, but I think knowing that is very easy. It's a very easy way to distinct between great and just good.
And what are the things that help you feel excited? Is it part of the distillation of, you talked about that 2-word distillation of an idea? Like what are the things that can help you get excited about something?
I think great communication, but you also know it's going to do a bigger job for the brand. It's actually going to solve a business problem. It's simple. You think people will want to watch it or interact with it. I think it's a number of different things, but I think when something is aligned properly and it does all of these things really well, I think there's something in you that just kind of says, okay, I can't wait to present this. And I know some of the work that we've all been involved in the past has had those things going for it, and there's a bit of a science to it that's hard to put your finger on, right? But sometimes it's just so right, you can just feel it.
Yeah. What about Nick, from your point of view? What's your? I mean, that's from a creative perspective about that gut reaction of I can't wait, that excitement, and that's definitely something I've felt historically. You go in as a SWAT team, and you're like, yeah, right, we're gonna smash this. This is going to be great. So right. But from a strategic perspective, what would you say are the things that can help? What are the secrets to great work?
Oh God, I mean, I think weirdly, and I probably shouldn't say this given I'm a card-carrying planner, right? But I think weirdly, thinking overly strategically and logically can get in the way. Because I think one of the things about great work, and let's be clear what we mean by that, we mean work that's unexpected, disproportionately powerful, really connects with people. It has to be stuff that you haven't seen before. It can't be completely out of the blue. There's a phrase, isn't there, at Maya, the idea of being most advanced yet acceptable, which is the ideas that tend to kind of really catch fire tend to be, they have elements of familiarity about them so that you know where you are with them, but they are at the same time new, right? And sometimes when you're reviewing a lot of ideas, it can be very easy to be drawn to the things which make logical sense, they fit best practice, they are what the machine would have done had the machine been fed all the information that we all have. You can't go for those ideas if you want to make great work. You have to go for the thing that slightly doesn't make sense, or that kind of comes from nowhere, or that has a bit of a weird leap to it. And that's not, I think, good planners, I think, should, as much as anybody in a good creative organisation, should be fine-tuned to be looking for that stuff. But that's a really important thing to look for. But it's a harder and harder thing to create space for in a world where we have so much certainty, so much data, so many clever ways of working out what the right thing to do is.
So good being, and logic being the enemy of the great.
It can be, can't it?
Need to be careful of best practice as being desperately ordinary. Kirsten, how do you know a good idea when you hear it or see it?
Yeah, I think I would agree with the guys. It's we're always trying to look for something slightly special and different that hasn't been done before, and that makes you feel something. And then I think when you then take a step back and you look at how it fits in the broader kind of strategic vision, if it really ticks all of those boxes, it not only does what you want your campaign to do, but it really ladders up into where you're taking your brand. I think that gets really exciting. And I always talk with the team about, just somebody sat on the sofa at home, with their partner in the evening, do they care about what they're seeing? Because we can't, I think sometimes you can get a little bit carried away and think that people are sitting around waiting to see your next campaign. Of course, they're not. They really don't care, and it's our job to make it interesting and engaging and compelling enough to make them sit up and want to watch it. So I think when you sense that you've got that tick, then that's really exciting.
Yeah, Lynne, if you're still with us, hopefully. I'm curious from your perspective, obviously here on the Kantar side of the fence, it's sort of, we've got a particular perspective, I guess. What's your learning about how can marketeers stack the odds in their favour when developing a campaign? Are there things that sort of tend to be overlooked, in developing a campaign, which can, sort of, stack the odds in someone's favour?
I think I touched on some of the things at the beginning in what I was outlining. So, understanding your audience. Nick's point, I completely agree with, and what Simon was saying, having a really distinctive idea that evokes emotion. We need to think about how the brain works. I think often sometimes where we see things going wrong is there's this effect called knowledge bias. And you get so close to the idea, what the story is meant to be. As a marketer and a creative agency, you know what the connections are. And when you experience it, of course, because you've got that bias, you see it. But someone else who hasn't got that closeness and that proximity can't make those connections. So I think that's where stepping back and looking at things through, the consumer's eyes and knowing how the brain works, that it's lazy, that we won't put in effort. And as you've all been saying, that, fundamentally, it's not something we're interested in. We've got to earn that attention. I think all of those things really matter.
And sort of a question for everyone, sort of something I'm kind of conscious of is obviously, ultimately, it is about the audience. It's about creating that response in the audience, making them feel something or making them care. Have we just forgotten how to speak to real people? Are we doing, whether you call it qualitative research or some other, are we speaking to normal people enough? Or, John Webster, I remember him, 70s, Smash Martian fame, and Hofmeister, Follow the Bear, and some great campaigns. And he was a total advocate for qual, and just chat, or at least speaking to real people with very raw stim and seeing how they reacted. Exactly like you're saying about that edit suite moment. Are we doing that stuff enough, or actually? Yeah, I mean,
no, we're not, are we? And I think that's back in the days you're talking about, this is at my agency 40 years ago, but John Webster was writing all those amazing, and it was TV then. It doesn't have to be now. Planners would do 200 call groups a year.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just a phenomenal amount of research that was done. And quite often it came back with stuff that people didn't want to hear, but it was a bracing encounter with the truth and how people really felt, and how a disinterested bunch of people really felt. And the great thing about it being and I know qual has been around for a long time now, but you don't get answers that are put into a box. You get the raw, unfiltered opinion about people who are kind of not really engaging in whether your idea on a PowerPoint chart is right or not. They're just kind of going, do I like it, do I not? Now, we do that in different ways these days. I mean, but by the way, you can do UX, you can do user research in exactly the same way, right? But it's the same principle. It's kind of putting stuff in front of real people as much as we possibly can and seeing how they react to it, or it's about putting stuff in front of people in the real world. But I think getting that steer, that unfiltered steer on how real people are reacting to whatever it is you're doing, I think is critically important, and we don't do nearly enough of it.
Okay.
I just want to say, I also don't think we necessarily appreciate just how used to good storytelling they actually are.
Yeah.
I don't know if any of you watch Lego Masters, but it's a bit of a thing for me and my kids, right? But when the guys come over from Lego and they're like, yes, what you built's lovely and I love how it moves, but they're like, what's the story? What's the story? And my 9-year-old boy is like, oh, I think this is the story. And I don't think, obviously we can talk about Netflix and Amazon Prime and Insta stories and all of those things, but I just think there is a huge swell in quality of storytelling that consumers are exposed to that means that we used to lead. I think advertising used to lead the way. I think in many ways now we need to be keeping up. And I think we need to speak to people more, but I think we also need to understand just how good they are understanding a narrative. And I think it means that the quality of the work needs to just go even further.
The bar's been raised. Winnie, has anyone been asking questions?
We've got quite a few questions.
Okay, hit me.
I think one of the questions is what you guys just touched on a little bit around, why do consumers feel so disconnected? There's a bit around, not really talking to them. But do you think there's anything else to that?
First thing is, I don't know how connected we want them to feel. I mean, that's the first and most important thing is probably, let's remember that people don't generally love brands. They certainly don't really love communication. So let's kind of understand. Let's be honest about where the bar is. That's done. I think it is a lot of the things we've been talking about, isn't it? I think we live in. There's a lot of insight everywhere in big inverted commas, but I don't know how insight. A lot of that stuff isn't the same as looking somebody in the eye, metaphorically or literally, and understanding how they're reacting to the things that we're doing, whether that thing is brand design, whether it's product, whether it's advertising, whatever it is. I think we've lost the instinct for that because we don't do it enough.
That's interesting. Any more?
I think the point around humour, the fact that we don't really see a lot of humour anymore, really resonates with people. And the question is, do we think brands are really now scared of using humour in advertising, and how can we use it more?
I'd love to direct that to Kirsten. Kirsten, did you get that question?
Yeah, I did. I don't know. It's a funny question for me because in a way, humour is one emotion that you could elicit through your comms. So I don't think I've ever gone into something thinking, let's do something and make it funny. It has to be whatever is right for what you're trying to achieve with that piece of communication. I wonder if the question is angling at, whether brands feel a little bit nervous to put themselves out there, which potentially perhaps brands are a little bit scared, because I guess the thing about humour is some people will like it and other people won't like it, and it's definitely a safer strategy to do something that universally people are going to love, because then you don't have any concerns. But I don't know. What do the guys think?
I've got an opinion that you're generally in humour, you're always laughing at someone or something. And I think that the Tesco example for Christmas is hilarious because we're all laughing at ourselves. And I think that's actually really quite funny because during the pandemic, I think everybody misbehaved in one way or another, where they stockpiled toilet paper or went on holiday. And I think there was just this lovely observation that actually none of us had performed brilliantly. So actually, I think you managed to get away with it because you're not being pointed. But I think it does come down to risk. And comedy is really hard to do without pointing the finger or highlighting somebody or a way of thinking or a way of doing something. So you're always going to polarize somebody or margin some group in some way. I think the trick has to be finding humour that doesn't do that.
Yeah. Okay, we've got a minute to go, so I'm going to fire a question to all of you. In one sentence, what can we most learn from Shakespeare when it comes to creativity?
I mean, for me, just getting back to great storytelling. Simple.
Nick?
That's quite hard, isn't it?
He's thinking. I'll give him a second while he's thinking. Kirsten.
That's a really difficult question. I think for me, it's about making people feel something, and ideally taking them on a little bit of an emotional journey that's really rewarding as part of that.
System 1, Lynne.
I would go for bravery, I think. And I've got another quote for you. Our doubts are traitors and make us lose the good that we oft might win by fearing to attempt. I think you've all touched on that to an extent. So, believing in something and having the courage to go with it and putting the doubts to bed.
Okay, and Nick, final one.
I'm not sure I've got much further in the 2 minutes, but I think there's a thing about remembering your role is to be entertaining to as many people as you can be, while not pandering to the lowest common denominator. I mean, Shakespeare was amazing at putting some pretty stretching ideas in front of people, but never forgetting that his job was to be a dramatist and to make people excited and laugh and cry and have a good night out, and then remember it and talk with it about their mates the next day. And I think we are largely, although for different reasons, in the same industry. So
be brave, be entertaining, tell a story, make them feel something. There we go, it's easy, right? Thank you so much, panel. It's a really useful and revealing panel, and hopefully oozing with common sense and potential pointers for all the brands that might be tuning in. Winnie.
Cool, right. We've probably still got 2 more things to go. I think we are running a bit behind schedule, but we will be catching up. So there are 2 things going on. On stage 2, we'll be looking into how to use behavioral science to fight for a better future. So quite big topic, but actually we've got some wonderful brains with us. We've got the Harvard professor, a doctor, and a Kantar expert. So I'm sure hopefully after the session you'll be able to be inspired with some tangible actions after it. And then on stage 1 here, we're going to do a bit of a quick change. So we will disappear slightly for a second, but we'll be back with Kimberly and Yauti. I can see they're already. They're going to talk a little bit about embedding all the stuff, all the inspiration, all the insights that we've got, throughout the day and generally in your work life. How do you actually embed it in your business and drive change? So there you go.